Hi, my name's Reuben. In this series of videos, I walk you through the sample Poor Doctors application that I developed for the introduction of Gennaro Mobile. In this video, I look at the first splash screen, and in particular the programmable web component that we use on that screen. So I'll run the application first so you can see what we're referring to. So it's this first screen here that we're looking at, and I'll go over some of these options, what happens in the code. So from the main.4gl, we saw that one of the last things it did was call splash.execute. So that splash is defined up the top in the import FGL. So it's saying import the splash.4gl file and call the execute function. What that execute function does is it opens a window, calls this function, and then closes the window when it's finished. And that function is a very simple input statement using a web component. So I'll look at the form first, so splash.per. If you're wondering why I'm using a 4FD, just at this stage in the EAP process, there's a small bug with the 4FD, so I'm looking at where web components are involved. So I'm just looking at the .per at this stage, but hopefully in the future this will be a 4FD. Okay, so the screen just has one field on it, which is a web component. The important things to note with the web component is to put the stretch equals both, so it takes up the whole screen, and the component type property, which at this stage is set to programmable. What that means is that it'll use this programmable.html as my web component. And this web component has two key bits that we should see. The first bit is this set by ID method. In our 4GL code, we will see that we actually call this method, but what that basically does is it replaces the ID we pass in with the HTML value. So it replaces the inner HTML with what's passed in there. And coming back the other way, we've also got this exec action, which is called by our HTML. So that's the two-way interaction between the 4GL and the HTML. One way going in, we're setting the HTML, then coming back the other way, we're saying, hey, this is the action we called and the value we're going to pass back. But the value isn't actually important for this bit of the code. So if we look at our splash.4gl, here is our called UI.interface front call. It's a web component call, and it's calling the web component that's in formony.splash. So there's our field name, formony.splash, and it's calling the function set by ID. So this was this function highlighted earlier, set by ID, and it's passing to it the argument root and the HTML. So I'll look at that root first. So that's the ID within our HTML. If we look at our initial ID, there's our empty division with ID equals root. So the code's going to replace this div with what's been passed into it. And the final bit, what's been passed in, which is the value, is the, let's give ahead one stage, is the result of this function splash underscore HTML, which is down the bottom of our code. It's a very simple bit of HTML, which uses the whole screen, so left, top, height and width, left 0, top 0, height and width 100%, and throws in there an image, so splash underscore iPhone, and sets up an on-click action so that if anyone clicks on that image, then we're going to execute the splash action without setting a value of null. And that splash action is what we can see in the 4GL code. So here's our on-action splash, and that actually goes on to our next screen, the job header list. So when we run that, there's our image being displayed, our iPhone 5 splash image, and we tap on it to continue on to our next screen. So that's what that on action is doing. Whenever you click anywhere on this image, it's triggering that 4GL action splash. Now the other actions that are on here help goes off to a web page and just displays a little bit of help for the application. So we look inside our code. It's making use of the browser web component, which I'll talk about later in another video, and that's the URL that's passed to it. We've also got a video link, which again is just using the browser web component to show a video, and the about, which is just showing a message using library function that's going to display this text. So when we click on about, we get that little bit of text being displayed. Other options up here, there's the synchronization process, which will be in a subject of another video. So that's the refresh action. So we go off and do our sync process. And the final action I want to talk about is the settings action on our application. And that's something you'd normally delete before you'd remove this action before you deploy it or hide it away somehow. But this enables just some useful things for development. So deleting all the data from the database, forcing an error and testing that the error handling code works, and creating a random job. So that helps with the generating test data. So those settings applications, again, they're probably ones you're going to delete before you actually deploy the app to production. That I'd intend to delete before I deploy the app, but they just enable me to do some useful things for development. If you're with your real application, for your own application, you would probably have a settings screen in here and have a number of settings for the application. So for this Pool Doctors app, we've investigated settings for the different type of map we'd use, or how many days data we want to keep, what images we're seeing, that type of thing, or what your name is, or what jobs you want to download. So you can put, whatever you want to create under that settings, but just for this sample application, we've just got some options that enable you to delete the data or generate some data. And so all those options here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, they're just various on actions underneath our input statement. Things to note with our input statement, we're always using unbuffered, so you'll see I'll add that to all my dialogues, and without defaults equals true, just out of habit, I'll add those as well. And cancel and accept, so we don't have any, we're not entering anything, if you like, to this application, so we don't, and it's the first application on the screen, so I set that cancel equals false, so that we don't get a back action up here. Okay, if we had cancel equals true, then we'd have an action to go back, but because this is the first screen, there's nothing to go back to. And because we're not entering any data, that's why I set accept equals false. Okay, so hopefully that's a good explanation of that initial screen we see, our splash screen. So it's an input statement using a web component to draw an image on the screen and just being able to respond to it. Some people say you perhaps shouldn't have the splash screen, but I just feel that it's perhaps better to see something like this on the first screen you run rather than perhaps something like that. Okay, so that's the purpose of that splash screen, just that first place you come to, give you a few options before you get into the application proper. Okay,